Well, hello. I'm Jim Shine, working with the NASCA Origins Committee, studying the origins of constellations in North America, especially before the first North American Conference in 2005. And I have one of the elders of the field, Susan Ulfelder, with me today. Ulfelder, elders. So welcome, Susan. Thank you for coming and agreeing to be interviewed. So
you're very welcome, Jim. Thank you for inviting me.
No, you go way back. Go ahead.
It gave me time to go back and have a life review about this.
Well, you first learned about constellations in somewhere around 1999, is that correct?
In the fall of '99, I took a workshop with Dietrich Klinghardt out in Seattle, Washington. And the last of the 3 days, a Sunday afternoon, he devoted to family constellations. And he invited two women. To this day, I still don't remember their names, but I wish I did. That gave a family constellation workshop. And I remember my reaction is like, I spent all this time and money and to get here to study with Dietrich, and now he's having us, this new thing that it turns out I was chosen as a representative for a granddaughter of a man of the grandfather who was excluded. And I sat in the back row, I wasn't even interested in this. I sat in the back row. They chose me. So I'm standing in the center of the circle. And in those days, it was very facilitator directed. So you could not move and you could not speak unless you were directed to. And so I'm welling up with tears. I'm getting very emotional as my grandfather is being brought in. And when the facilitator came to me and says, "What do you want to do?" I burst into tears and I ran across the room and I jumped in my grandfather's arms. And that was the culmination of the constellation. And I remember walking back through the 3 rows where I had been hiding and realizing that I was very emotional, and I walked back past the first row and it diminished, and I got to the second row and it diminished. By the time I sat in my seat, I was myself again. And I realized that my whole life had just changed, that this was such a powerful experience that I needed to know more. Mm-hmm. And that's what set me on this entire path. So I'm very grateful to those 2 women who I sat there grumbling, to myself, and they don't even speak English, and we're having to do this workshop. And, and I'm very grateful to Dietrich and always will be for exposing me to this work. And it turns out that I had to find out, those days there was very little internet. I certainly wasn't on it back then. And I had to find out where Bert Hellinger was going to be and how I could learn it. It turns out he had been coming to the comprehensive cancer care conferences here in Washington, D.C., and was giving a several-hour workshop on constellations and cancer. I could not attend the first one because I had the flu. So it turns out there was another year he came. I took that on a Thursday and had found out that Susie Tucker was sponsoring Bert Hellinger in New York City the following Saturday and Sunday. So I went down here to the workshop with Dale Schusterman, and we observed Bert working at the cancer conference. And then my husband John and Dale and I all took the train and we went up to the workshop in New York City that Bert Hellinger and Hunter Beaumont were teaching together. Mm-hmm. It turns out it was the last time that they were together. It felt very contentious between the 2 of them, and then they were never together again. So at that workshop, It was very powerful, very dramatic, very emotional and moving. And Harold Honan, who was the cameraman, who was Bert's scheduler at the time, and traveling companion and cameraman, announced that there was going to be a year-long training. And I sat there saying, "Oh God, how am I going to tell John I want to take this training? You know, it's expensive. It's time away from home, money in New York, for room and board. And how am I going to do this?" By the time I got the courage to put my name on the list, John's was already on there. So
no problem there.
Exactly. So John and I and Dale Schusterman took the training together. And it was a very powerful training. Harold Honan was a wonderful teacher. At that time, there were no books. In the middle of not one book in English on family constellations. At that time, in the middle of our training, Harold gave us a manuscript copy of Bert's book, Love's Hidden Cemetery, the first one.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of.
So Harold, if Bert was your first teacher, I guess, then Harold was right
Harold,
behind.
I really consider Harold to be my first teacher.
Okay.
I just observed Bert, but Harold, I honor him immensely. He's a wonderful teacher, and he and Hunter Beaumont. Harold taught 5 classes, and Hunter Beaumont taught the last one. So it was 6 3-day weekends in New York. And while we were there, I learned that Bert was coming to the cancer conference in DC again. And it turns out it was the weekend that I was going to be teaching at Capital University of Integrative Medicine. So I approached Harold about Bert doing a workshop for my class, just the small 20 people. And then the longer we talked, the more I thought maybe the whole school should participate and be exposed to Bert Hellinger. So it became a Friday afternoon to a Friday evening, and then it became an all-day Saturday workshop as well. So I went from inviting Bert to come to my class to then putting on a huge workshop. And it turned out to be 175 people and 225 people at the lecture and the night before. It was a really big deal. And
this is the first of several. You brought him over several times in the early 2000s.
Absolutely. That was the beginning. And because it was so successful, Bert asked through Harold if I would do a 3-day couples workshop, if I would organize it for Bert the following August. And so we set about, Lynn and I decided
Lynn's your
that we
sister,
had,
right?
Lynn is my extraordinaire office manager who happens to be my younger sister.
Okay.
And we've been working as a family in family constellations for a long time together now. And we set about finding a place and decided that we needed to set up a business. So we set up the Hellinger Institute in DC in order to funnel all the information to, and the checks and email and all of this. We ended up having to get a new computer because my Apple computer did not communicate with people in Tokyo or London or Venezuela. So I ended up having to get a new PC computer and a fax machine, which we didn't have. And when I mentioned it to Bert, the first thing he said to me was, "Susan, you're going global." He was a man of few words.
Mhm.
And so we sponsored that workshop. We had 425 people in that October. And at the same time, I was sponsoring Harold that year for a training in DC. We
Mhm.
had over 35 people. We had to cap it.
And what year would this have
And
been, Susan?
that was, I will tell you. It was 2000, 2001.
Okay, so that's very early. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. So the workshop that we took in New York was June 10th through 11th in 2000. And then the following year, I sponsored a training here in DC. Susie Tucker sponsored another training in New York City. And the third training was down in Florida, in Davies, Florida, that Drindy Keller had sponsored. And so Harold was doing 3 trainings in the States
Wow.
at the same time,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And he said he was only going to be doing it twice, which I feel like he kept his word, because later on he had a stroke and couldn't come. And that's why John and Dale and I took over the training the next year. And I've been doing trainings every year since.
So you've been training for almost 20 years.
I have been.
Yeah.
I have been.
Yeah.
And in May, and at the end of that training in August of 2001, actually in May of 2001, they had the first international Hellinger intensive in CIS, Germany. And Dale and John and I went, and they had Bert Hellinger and Hunter Beaumont and Gunther Weber and Albrecht Marr and Jakob Schneider and Ilse Kushnera.
Is that what eventually became the Burn Read conferences?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
There were 2 of them that were Zist that I attended, and then they went to Burn Read.
Okay. Okay.
And there was also, in June of 2001, a workshop that Dietrich Klinghardt did with Bert Hellinger at the Omega Institute of Holistic Studies in New York. And that was a very interesting workshop to have attended. And we ended up sponsoring, Bert did another cancer conference in October of 2001 here in DC on cancer and the family system, cancer and constellations. And then there was the second intensive, Hellinger intensive in Zist. And Bert Hellinger and Hunter Beaumont and Gunther Weber and Albrecht Marr and Jakob Schneider, Gunny Baxa, Ursula Franke, and Eva Madeline, all the top.
All the European elders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in 2000,
didn't you?
In the second year that Susie Tucker sponsored, in New York, the last workshop was Gunther Weber. So he came and did an organizational constellation workshop that time. And the second one down here, we had Stefan Hausner. So I was the first person to have Stefan Hausner come to the United States. And he came for several times in the DC area.
He's still practicing, so yeah.
Absolutely. And in August of 2002 is when I did the couples workshop for Bert here in DC. And that's the one that we had 425 people sign up.
You've sponsored Bert a couple of times in DC. That was just like the first. Well,
that was the first big one,
right.
But it was the second that I did. And every time he came, he did an extra day for the people that wanted to learn the work that he called learning circles.
Uh-huh.
And then in February of that year, 2003, Bert went down to Davies, Florida, and did a workshop there that is on one of our DVDs called Growth Takes Root in the Past Laid to Rest.
Yeah,
I just
no,
love that title.
I was going to bring that up later, but since you brought it up now, people that didn't know it, Susan has an incredible selection of DVDs and books. I've availed myself of them many times. So she has some old DVDs of stuff from the 2000s that I don't think anyone else has. So I'm very grateful personally for having that resource.
Yes, thank you. You're welcome. And it's an honor. Now, I started that bookstore originally just to have the books available for my trainings, because people weren't ordering them. So I'd order a dozen, and then we have them available for the training. And then more and more books became available, and that's how it just developed, you know. And after several of the trainings, and what Bert did is he gave me the master tape, and I had it. I took it to a video editor man who duplicated it and produced it. It was originally a cassette tape, and then
way back,
and then I had them converted to DVDs, and then the third step was I had them, what do they call it? Break them up into segments so that you could hit a button and it would go to the next constellation, and you hit a button and go. So we've done a lot to promote this work, you know.
Yes, you definitely have. Yeah. So.
And then Bert ended up in November of 2003 out in Santa Barbara, where he did a workshop on psychosis. That's called Families in Turmoil in our DVD selection. And right after that was the first International Congress for the Americas down in Oaxaca, Mexico. And the Germans that were there were Bert, Guntard Weber, Jakob and Siglinde Schneider, and Stefan Hausner. And I was the only presenter, the only trainer who was a presenter at that particular conference. And I gave a workshop on presence.
The only U.S. presenter, is that what you're saying?
The only U.S. presenter, and the only representative on a panel for the U.S. So it was a great honor for me to be there. Something I didn't expect, you know.
Yeah, so it caught on better in Mexico early on, or is that not?
Oh, my goodness. It was there, Jim, that I realized, wow, what a difference in the cultures, you know. The culture in Mexico and all the South Americans and Central Americans were there. They're so family oriented, you know. It was just really caught on. And at that panel discussion, I had said that the reason that I thought that it hadn't caught on so well in the United States is we're a country of immigrants. We're looking for a better life, and we graduate high school or college and we move as far away from home as possible, you know. And then a $5,000 job comes along and we move to that job, and we keep looking for that better life, you know. And all we need to do is turn around and look at our families. You know, that's the answer. But in this country, we're still looking forward and still jumping ahead, you know, to the next thing.
Yeah, I remember I talked to Brigitte Staub recently, and she lives out on the West Coast, and she says that some of her clients, if they could move even farther west, they would, but they've just run out of land.
Exactly. No, that's absolutely the truth. And so that was in 2003. And then I believe that there was a bit of a lull, and then there was the first conference in Portland that
Mhm.
Jane Peterson put on.
Mhm. And you were at that, I'm sure.
I was, and I was only there for one day actually, and
Mhm.
I gave two workshops.
Mhm.
One I don't even remember the name of, but the second one was on how to organize workshops that my sister Lynn and I gave.
Mhm.
And we had people asking all kinds of questions and wanting to know how you do it. And, and we
Mhm.
gave the particulars. You get a room that doesn't have any posts in the middle of it,
Mhm.
basic things that people don't understand,
Mhm.
but need to know to set up workshops. So it was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
And I
Great.
left early from that conference because I had a wedding to go to. So that's why I was only
Mhm.
there for one day.
Mhm. Yeah, and you've gone to all of them since, and your bookstore's been there as well. So yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
We offer that as a great service to those who are interested in family constellations
Hmm.
because it's our way of promoting Bert's work.
Hmm. Yes, yes, I'm grateful for what you've done. So when I'm guessing you started doing your own workshops in the early 2000s as well, facilitating.
Actually, it was right after my third weekend training, in the first training, that
Hmm.
Dale and I had a workshop.
Hmm.
And my very first constellation was um, a woman who wanted more creativity.
Hmm.
That was her issue. And it went back down the mother's line. Her grandmother was
Hmm.
schizophrenic,
Hmm.
and she had four children, and the creativity came through the mothers to the children.
Hmm.
All I did was set up the mothers, and the energy flowed.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until last week, literally last week, that I worked with this woman about the issue of schizophrenia in her family. So it's been 20 years
Wow,
that we finally, you know,
full
and
circle.
and and Bert says that it was a murder within the family by a family member that
Hmm.
is the basis of psychosis
Hmm.
and schizophrenia. And so I actually found that in this woman's history. So
Yeah.
it's ongoing, Jim, keeps
Yeah,
moving.
yeah, absolutely. When you teach people, what are, well, or teach or facilitate, are there any particular main points you try and teach, or gems of
I'm
wisdom you try and pass on to
yeah,
people?
I'm really big on order, and a lot of times things resolve as order is placed in the constellation.
Hmm.
What I have also realized is it's not just moving people from one place to another to put them in the correct place. And it's not just phrases, sentences, and words, phrases, and sentences that need
Hmm.
to be said that hadn't been said. But
Hmm.
because of the work I do in my healing practice, I'm very aware that there are emotional patterns that didn't start with us. No,
Hmm.
they started further back in the family system. And so I do a lot of work clearing family emotional patterns transgenerationally.
Hmm.
So I find that I don't necessarily teach that because it's not specifically constellations, but if
Hmm.
I'm doing a workshop and a person needs it, I'll incorporate it.
Hmm. Okay.
So we teach about conscience and the different types of conscience that Bert talks about. We
Hmm.
teach who belongs to the family. And in this day and age, there are so many blended families
Hmm.
and, and
Yeah.
including, everybody's stepchildren and where they belong. And at one of the intensives. Oh, I forgot to tell you about the North American intensives that they had in Santa Barbara. There were several of them, and the initial one, the Germans came.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, Stefan Hausner came, and then the rest of us American trainers took over, and I presented at that point as well.
And these have been in the early 2000s as well?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it was.
Okay.
I could look up the dates for you
Yeah,
if you need it. Okay.
No, we can get them later. Thanks. Yeah.
But they were really important as well. They were based on how they ran ZIST, which is
Mm-hmm.
more of an intensive than a conference.
Right.
You know, where
Right.
people just had constellations, you know, one
Mm-hmm.
after another.
Yes.
They were very important. And in my training, we do a lot with perpetrator victim.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot. And because my office was originally in Bethesda, Maryland, very close to NIH, the National Institute of Health, there were a lot of interns there that came from Europe, a lot of young women from Poland and Italy that came to my workshops and trainings because it was available here, and they knew about it from their countries. So we had a very rich training experience because of so many people from around the world. And this year, the training will have someone from Panama, someone from Romania, and there were supposed to be 2 people from the UAE, but they postponed because they're not at that post at the moment, and their internet connection is not good where they're posted right now in Lebanon. So it is truly becoming global.
Yes. Yeah, and you're still training because you're starting a new training this weekend. We were chatting before we started recording. Yes.
Starts in 3 days.
Do you where if anywhere do you see constellations evolving in the future?
Oh, I really see that it's going to continue. Even though it's had a slow start here in the United States, I find that the people that are attracted to it really get so much out of it. And then it's by word of mouth. They tell their friends, they tell their family members, and that's how it's really spreading, you know? You don't have to advertise, people will find you.
Yeah, it is funny how the ether tends to draw people, whatever you want to call it, tends to draw people into this. So
absolutely.
I've heard so many stories along those lines. It just happened. So,
one of my trainees that has joined this coming weekend was out on the Camino Real in Spain, you know, walking however many miles it is a day for this. And someone told him about constellations, and as soon as he got back to the States, he looked us up. So
yeah, that's
amazing.
Pilgrimage to, what is it, Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain. We've been doing it for 1,000 years. Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And I think constellations are going to be here just that long as well.
Oh, that's cool too. I hope so. I hope so. Anything else you want to add before we close that we haven't gone over?
At this point, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think you've extracted out of me as much of the information as I could say. I have some personal stories I could tell you about, Bert, but I don't think that's really what you want.
Well, it's up to you. It's so, you know.
I'll tell you one.
Okay.
I was sitting after a workshop, I don't even remember which one it was, in the early 2000s, and sitting next to Bert. Everybody was leaving, picking up their things and leaving, and he turns to me and he says, "I'm getting married." And the entire room, just the energy in that room was such love, just amazing. And I remember sitting there saying to myself, "Oh my God, I'm only on my first. I can't wait for my second marriage, you know, if this is what it's going to be." I can't even explain to you the love that was in that room. It was
Mhm.
amazing. So from having been a Jesuit priest for 25 years
Mhm.
and have 2 marriages, he was a fairly remarkable man. Yeah. And as I said, a man of few words.
Mhm. Okay, well, thanks very much for taking the time to enlighten posterity on your elder's experience, Susan. Thank you very much. So,
You're very welcome, Jim. Thank you for having me.
my pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
That better?
Wait.